Speaking of the IFS, one thing has been said a lot of in the last few days, and that is of the conspiracy of silence, in that both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are not promising any kind of substantial rises in tax or any substantial public sector cuts, despite the fact that both of their self-imposed fiscal rules mean that debt has to be falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of a 5-year period. And if they want to hit that projection, under current projections, with the same current fiscal policy, they will have to do public sector cuts of up to £18 billion. That's a lot of public sector cuts, and neither party wants to admit it because they don't want to break their own self-imposed fiscal rules about what has to happen to the debt. Now, this is from numbers produced by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is, of course, an ideologically defined think tank of people who are non-partisan but that nevertheless centre-right, so take their figures with a pinch of salt. But the head of the IFS was on Trevor Phillips' show yesterday on Sky News, talking about this conspiracy of silence and why he thinks that each party refuses to discuss these figures. Let's have a watch.
Well, let's ask the Institute for Fiscal Studies Director, Paul Johnson. There is a temptation to go bears and woods here. But anyway, let's just start with your point this week, where you said there's a conspiracy of silence between the major parties to hide the truth of what the government will inherit. What did you mean by that?
What I mean is they don't really want to talk about the scale of the challenge facing them. Look, the government is effectively planning cuts in public spending over the next 5 years. That's what's in their budget numbers. The Office of Budget Responsibility, as well as ourselves, have pointed that out. They've talked about a 1% a year increase in public service spending. Now, that doesn't sound too bad, but we know that defence spending will rise faster than that. We know that health spending will rise faster than that. We know that childcare spending will rise faster than that. What's left is less than nothing for everything else, given the
Remember, a lot of those things are ring-fenced budgets. If it's a ring-fenced budget, it will increase with at least inflation, which is going to be higher than the 1% increase in spending elsewhere. So what really and truly that does mean is cuts elsewhere to fund additional extra spending, all of these ring-fenced departments. It's why certain departments under George Osborne really got slashed, like arts funding, because they were doing austerity whilst keeping NHS spending like nominally the same whilst decreasing it as a percentage of GDP, but also absolutely hammering things like the welfare bill, absolutely hammering things, discretionary spending for things that benefit the country socially, youth clubs, Sure Start. That was a real problem.
Given the numbers that we've got. Now, both parties have tied themselves to exactly the same, in my view, rather bizarre fiscal rule, which is they want debt falling in the last year of the part. So they've tied themselves to those things. So we have a choice. Either they are actually going to implement these spending cuts. I think that's highly unlikely, given the scale of the challenges facing
because the numbers in some departments they're talking about 10-15% cuts.
But we know that we've got prison backlogs, we've got justice backlogs, we've got local authorities going bust left, right, and centre. It seems to me implausible that they're going to implement those cuts.
The thing is that this is somebody from a centre-right think tank essentially saying that Rachel Reeves and Jeremy Hunt's fiscal rules also, we'll find out later on today, part of the Lib Dems fiscal rules as well. Funny that. They're just all kind of copying from the same hymn sheet of debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of the Parliament. Even the centre-right IFS think this is a stupid fiscal rule. Like John McDonnell was on Peston saying that they should extend this fiscal rule for 10 years rather than 5 years as part of their plan for national renewal. Of course, when it came to John McDonnell, for example, there were a lot of different taxes they wanted to do to be able to fund a bunch of their promises. And of course, they were going to be swapping bonds for the shares of a bunch of industries they wanted to nationalise. So they had a different kind of plan for their own fiscal rules. But even the IFS head, the head of the IFS, is more left-wing than Rachel Reeves, and is essentially saying the same thing as John McDonnell, the radical socialist, Marxist, commie Trotskyist pinko that everyone seems to believe that he is, even though he's basically just a social democrat at this point. Because, of course, if you want to rebuild this country that's been stripped away of all of the infrastructure that we need, all of the spending on public services that we need, all of the kind of basic fabric of our society has been stripped away by 14 years of austerity. At the very least, 10 years of austerity under Hammond and Osborne, and then Jeremy Hunt. You're going to have to spend money to do it. You literally have to spend money to do it, which we can't do if you have those self-imposed fiscal rules. So extending it to 10 years to create this national renewal, because we spend loads of money on the front end, all these new assets will then appreciate or generate revenue to be able to outspend the long-term bonds that you're going to be issuing to spend on this money. When bond yields might be lower, interest rates will come down as we get out of this economic slump. This is just sensible politics, and it's all self-imposed, and we're going to be locking ourselves into austerity unless something drastically changes. And again, yeah, absolutely, Ben. When John McDonnell first set that fiscal rule, it was when borrowing was fucking nothing, when interest rates were nothing, when bond yields tiny.
But they don't want to obviously talk about tax increases because that frightens the voters. But they have, as I said, tied themselves to this fiscal rule. Maybe they're just hoping they get lucky. Though I have to say, I think on the balance of probabilities, they won't, at least in the first budget, because if anything, the economic forecast that the last budget was based on was pretty optimistic. So what will they do? They're not telling us.
So your view is that at the very least, at some point, whoever's in government, they're going to have to find some money from somewhere. They're saying they're not borrowing. So it will have to be tax rises of some kind. Where might that come from, given they've ruled out rises in income tax, Labour's ruled out VAT and so on? What might we be looking at?
I mean, I do wish they'd stop ruling things out, because they may well find that they regret that when they assume office. Now, one thing it's worth saying is that there is a big tax rise nailed in. I mean, that's government policy, and it appears to be Labour Party policy, which is another 3 years freezing income tax allowances and thresholds. That is an 11.
That has been committed to by Jonathan Reynolds. It was specifically said, I think it was yesterday, that they were going to be keeping the fiscal drag for another 3 years, which is crazy. They keep saying, oh, we don't want to raise taxes on working people. You are going to be raising taxes through fiscal drag on working people. And yet we're not hearing anything about capital gains tax or wealth taxes. We will see from the Lib Dem manifesto later that they have a lot of things there about things like tax surcharges on banks and on share buybacks and like a financial sector tax, which is fine. It doesn't raise very much, but it's fine. And that still leaves this kind of gaping chasm in terms of public sector spending that there's, as you say, is a conspiracy of silence on. It's what Stephen Flynn was talking about on the debate stage. The proposed resolution foundation fiscal rules are so much better. One, in non-recessionary periods, we will ensure that all day-to-day spending is funded by taxation and will only borrow to invest, which is basically like the first fiscal rule of Rachel Reeves, but with the non-recessionary period as a caveat. So then recessionary periods, you can fiscally expand into stimulus to try and get the economy going again. We should have been doing for the entirety of the liquidity trap period. And we will ensure that in each year of the 5-year OBR forecast, public sector net worth as a proportion of national income is rising. We will ensure that debt interest payments stay below 8% of tax revenue. Like, these are much better fiscal rules because, again, they specifically treat investment in public assets against the national debt. Because if you have an asset, right, and we all invest debt into assets, that's what a mortgage is. Because you know, once you've paid off your mortgage, you will own a very expensive house. In the same way as even if you take out debt on a high interest rate, for example, or a high bond yield, which isn't even necessarily that high at the moment, on, I don't know, a mass green infrastructure publicly owned project, for example, like a bunch of nationally, fully publicly owned wind farms, there'll be assets that we keep forever or until we have to retire them, that will be generating revenue for the exchequer for longer than you'll be paying off the bond yields for.
£11 billion tax
Fucking
rise just there.
neoliberalism.
So that we're pretty sure we will get. Now, the sorts of things Labour have talked about so far, some private schools, private equity and so on, these are small numbers. I mean, I'm sure they'll try and, as it were, exaggerate the scale of those, but those are really very small numbers. What worries me, I suppose, is that we will then end up, because they've ruled out the sort of simple taxes, we'll end up with complicated and actually quite damaging, economically damaging taxes, whether it's on companies or on investment or what have you, which people can't see. They may be looking at.
But it's very funny to me that that's how right-wing, it's like, well, we need to have some more taxes. But as long as we're not taxing business people, corporations and banks, because they've ruled out all of the taxes on normal working people, I'm like, yeah, maybe that's the problem. That's the problem, mate, is that the wealthy people aren't being taxed enough and people like us are getting taxed through the nose.
At the banks, they may be looking at the interest that the Bank of England pays on the debt that it holds. So there's a set of things you can think about there, which obviously they're not being open about. I would expect changes to capital gains tax, which I think, it's quite right not to talk about that beforehand, because if you do start talking about that, then people will avoid it.
Squirrel it away.
By selling now. So there are things that I think it's reasonable not to talk about, but I think there are also things where, if they've got plans, they should be telling us.
In this campaign,
So when I say day-to-day spending, Solly, what I mean is on things that don't generate investment. So things that don't increase the net value of assets owned by the government, i.e. capital investment, right? So when I talk about the difference in capital investment and day-to-day spending, so money being spent building new hospitals or renovating schools that are going to collapse, or on business investment into green energy, for example, this is all capital investment. This usually comes out of fiscal expansion because you're creating assets out of it. You are not indeed spending money that other people then spend on assets that then they own. So day-to-day spending is things like the welfare bill, or wages of public servants, wages of public sector workers, energy bills, the state-owned properties have to pay for example. This is all day-to-day spending because it doesn't generate assets. Exactly.
Payne, ministers are particularly saying that Mel Stride said to me this morning, taxes are falling. Eventually, he sort of conceded they might not. Would I be unfair to use the word dishonest of the claim that taxes have been falling?
It depends who you're talking about here. So it is both true that taxes are rising overall and are at their highest level as a fraction of national income for getting on for 70 years. And it is also true that someone on average earnings is paying less in direct tax than they have at any point in the last 50 years. So, I mean, this Tory government, to coin a phrase, has really hit the highest earners, and it's really taken loads of money from corporations. Corporation tax has gone up, whilst...
But the tax thresholds have meant that working people pay huge amounts of money. We used to have 90% tax rates on the super rich. We used to have way higher corporation tax. This idea that somehow the Tory government, by slightly increasing corporation tax to not the lowest in the G7, just slightly higher, is somehow taking huge amounts of money away from corporations. That's crazy talk. What are you saying?
Cutting... actually genuinely cutting tax on average.
Just very briefly, Paul, if there's anything you want them to not say this week, what do you want them to stop saying?
Well, I wish they'd just stop saying what they're not going to do, because they tie themselves in knots. The more that they say we're not going to increase council tax or reform council tax, we're not going to increase income tax, we're not national insurance contributions and so on, the more they tie themselves into doing either just not being able to raise the money they might need, or raising it in ways that are actually more damaging than it would be if they were to do the more straightforward things.
And again, like, they say things like it's damaging to tax in this certain way. Damaging for who, I wonder? Again, you always got to understand the biases of these people, but broadly this idea that the fiscal rules, the self-imposed fiscal rules, are a needless straitjacket that will end us being put into continuity austerity. This is a reasonable thing for him to say. And I'm glad that somebody is saying it, especially somebody from a centre-right think tank who I usually would not agree with. The fact that we both agree the fiscal rules are dumb should show you just how dumb they really are. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for memberships. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.